Hello and welcome to the module on access control and identity management. I'm Ben McGee and I'm going to be walking you through this. Hopefully you can hang on tight and get ready for a ride. First we're going to talk about Radius and specifically talk a little bit about what that does and what you can do with that. It's really used for authentication. The name itself implies that it's for the dial-in, for the ability to use it. However, most of the time you see this in large networks. Typically, the internet service providers will provide the Radius clients to be able to see how much bandwidth you consume and be able to allow you to authenticate to their network through whatever connection is available. The next one that we'll talk about here is the TACACS, and it's similar to the Radius component. Cisco put it together early on and created it to what's called the extended TACACS or X-TACACS. But now, currently, they use the TACACS Plus, and it's used in the connection-oriented protocol, the TCP, Transmission Control Protocol. Kerberos in Greek mythology is known as the three-headed gatekeeper dog of the underworld, that's seen over on the right-hand side. Typically, any questions that you see on the exam will talk about the tickets and maybe about port 88 whenever they're talking about Kerberos. But essentially what happens is a user requests access to a service running on a server. The key distribution center, or KDC, authenticates the user and sends a request back with a ticket and allows that person access to a particular resource on the system. Microsoft uses Kerberos authentication in most of their products. LDAP is something that you will absolutely see on the exam. Typically, a lot of different questions come in that regard. Whole bunch of different flavors of the directory servers that are out there. Active Directory is one of them. Also, Oracle is a big one out there. Apache, IBM, Apple all have skin in the game as well. The LDAP stands for the Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, and really is a language and a way that you can logically represent things in the X.500 schema or the directory information tree. It's gone over port 389. And the secure version of that is port 636. So if you're using just a regular anonymous bind to an LDAP, it would be over port 389. If you wanted to use TLS or SSL LDAP, that would be over 636. So the big three A's, the triple A, the trifecta, if you will, in information security would be the authentication, authorization, and access control. Not to be confused with the CIA triad, the CIA triad being the confidentiality, data integrity, and availability. So this AAA right here gets into specifics on access control. What's the difference between identification and authentication? Identification typically is a user ID as opposed to something that is used to be able to authenticate you. It would be something like something you know, something you have, or something you are. And typically any two of those factor authentications, something you know, something you have, something you are, would be considered multi-factor authentication or strong authentication. Authentication specifically in the components that we know of, something you know would be like a PIN or a password, maybe your mother's maiden name. Something you are would be biometrics. And something you have would be like a CAC card or a smart card, maybe an RSA token, one of those three things, and probably a plethora of other things. Biometrics definitely has some skin in that game as far as the authentication is concerned. Obviously, very difficult to spoof biometrics. There's been a few movies that have been out there that have done just that, but in the real world, it typically is very difficult There is a measure of sensibility called the FRR and the FAR, the false rejection rate and the false acceptance rate. And where those two meet typically in a biometrics product is called the crossover error rate. And those three typically show up on the exam whenever we talk about biometrics. So the next one here on the bullets would be the tokens, and the very similar to the Kerberos concept that we talked about a little bit earlier, in that the tokens can be used in a synchronous environment where you may have a temporal token for maybe a 10-minute period. A lot of the social media sites, any banking, will use a session token to be able to allow access to a particular amount of objects for a specific amount of time. To enumerate this a little bit further, if you've never seen a CAC card before, the Common Access card, really it's a smart card. It's got a little chip inside of it that you can program. It's got a barcode that can be read. Usually it's got a facial, front facial picture of the person and some sort of hologram or a holographic mark on it for the DoD service that it provides for. We've also seen these personal identification verification, the PIV cards, which have come out since September 11th, that really helps to with the HSPD 12, the Homeland Security Presidential Directive number 12, and puts that in full effect. So a lot of times we see these two things on the exam as well, the mandatory access control and the discretionary access control. So the mandatory access control is something that the administrators have to make changes, and discretionary access control, it means that you can make changes. Whoever owns the file could make the change. It's at your discretion. And the way that you delineate between the two is mandatory could be something like a group policy or something along those lines, whereas the DAC would be enforced by an ACL or access control list. Usually Windows by default will make use of that DAC. The RBAC, the top one here, and I know both of these could be RBAC, role-based, and rule-based, but typically you'll see the role-based access control referred to as the RBAC. And that is basically assigning access privileges to job functions and roles. So people are put into buckets. Those buckets are then called roles, and those roles are assigned permissions to specific objects that are on the network. That could be controlled through something like an Active Directory or like an LDAP directory of some kind. Down here at the bottom, the rule-based access control, we have an allow or deny. Usually you'll see an if-then-else rule-based access control. Easiest way to think about that is like your Windows firewall, or if you've ever played around with like IP tables or some sort of other firewall. You have implicit allows or implicit denies, and explicit allows and explicit denies. Access control methods are really, there's a whole bunch of them here. Some of the ones that are of significant interest that you will see, the practice of least privilege is something that is near and dear to my heart. I know a lot of times people come 2, 3, 4 months after they start, and especially some of the C-level people, and say, why don't I have access to a particular folder or printer or something on the network, and you have not because you asked not, really, is what it comes down to with the least privilege and the principle of least privilege. The separation of duties really helps companies to have redundant backup in personnel to make sure that there's no issues and people aren't doing things they shouldn't be doing, really to keep an honest person honest. A few of these other ones that you see out there, mandatory vacations. A lot of people actually force their employees to take mandatory vacations because it helps boost morale, and really keeps people more fresh, as opposed to somebody who may not ever take vacations, or has 200-300 hours worth of vacations that they've been bankrolling for a while. So companies are starting to enforce mandatory vacations more often to make sure people remain sane. The account management really is a function of itself, and can be multiple people that could administer this. A lot of times you'll see nowadays, at least in the Windows Server domains, with the PowerShell starting to go into some of the command line based Active Directory components for modifying group objects or group policy objects. You get to a point where you can enforce policies. That could be things like password complexity. Have over 12 characters with bumpy caps, or camel case, where upper and lower case, as well as numbers and alphanumeric characters. Have expirations typically at 90 days. You'll see for passwords. Some sort of clipping level or threshold that can be met as well. If maybe somebody types the incorrect password 3 times, you lock them out for 15 minutes or something like that. A lot of focus is put on some of the next slides here. The Bell LaPadula is one of them. This is really specific to confidentiality. Bell LaPadula confidentiality. The premise here is that it has a lattice-based approach with an upper boundary and a lower boundary, and information cannot leave those boundaries. So you have a no read up and a no write down for Bell LaPadula. The upper boundary, the lower boundary, information can't leave, and it's for confidentiality specifics, specifically for this particular one. The BIBA, I like to say in my classes, the BIBA Las Vegas, just because it's an easier way to remember it. It's for the integrity. The Bell LaPadula we just talked about was for the confidentiality. This one's for integrity, and you have a limited use with an upper and lower boundary, where you have no write up and no read down. In this case, information could not be read down, as well as you can't write up to maybe corrupt or damage the integrity of data on the upper or lower bounds. The Clark-Wilson here, it talks a little bit about the sensitivity and how some of the applications can have a very robust power based on the privileges of the account that's connecting to the database. And it really sets forth a lot of value in adding some goodness to what kind of access controls to put onto your applications. Driver code or program code, sensitive and public. Being able to read from the application and write from the application. What are those privileges? Are you logging that? And those sorts of things are what comes with the Clark-Wilson. The information flow model is kind of neat. You have different sensitivity labels that are over on the left-hand side here, where restricted, sensitive, limited. You have the different information that's available here, and then an application that is able to massage the data, or based off of the identification and authentication and the authorization of the person, can make determinations on who can see what, when, and where, for how long. Typically that is the information flow model. The non-interference is similar, but basically you have different pipes, high class, low class, whatever the classified information could be, restricted, limited, public. It stays in that particular swim lane, and never the two shall meet. So it's a easy way to think of this as like sipper and nipper. It's totally segmented, no way to interfere with each other. And that's basically it. You've seen this on access control and identity management. Hopefully you've enjoyed this. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me at ben.c.mcgee@gmail.com.